So what we're going to talk about today is some history of component-based design. So where did it come from? Where did it start? How it transitioned from Brad Frost's atomic methodology to being more of what we commonly call component-based. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about how we use this and how we work with our clients through this new process because it's not as familiar to them. So component-based design really came out of this need from developers and software engineers who are really looking at different ways to increase their speed of work, to not be having to build repeated materials over and over again, to make applications faster, and also decrease the number of errors that could happen in code or whether they were just in release outputs. And it really combines two different approaches that are very common in web designing. And those two approaches were what developers use were basically frameworks, and for designers, it was style guides. So starting with the frameworks, a lot of developers were really using what was called component-based development for a long time. So you're looking at Bootstrap and Foundation and several others that really were frameworks that allowed developers to really quickly assemble a website. However, it didn't work that well for designers because there wasn't the relevant Photoshop file or other source files that allowed designers to use the frameworks or the components within their graphic editing programs. So it was actually building in a lot of time. Imagine if you have those multiple sites, a little bit more sometimes than just those little styling changes are needed. That deep customization required a lot more additional development. And the other issue with some of the frameworks was you ended up with a lot of unused code. And so you'd have so many elements that you could use, but you're not using them. Therefore, it was affecting the performance of the site. The second side was what developers commonly use, which is style guides, where you're building it from scratch and you can quickly use the components in your mock-ups, and that was great for the designers. However, then you had that delay in transition to the developers. You'd have some inheritance issues. For example, you might have multiple different sizes and styles of a button. But when a developer was reviewing the mock-ups that they would get from the designers, they were having a hard time figuring out which exact button. Was it a small button? Was it a medium button? What state did it need to start in? There was also a lot of issues with documentations. Often, you don't have a lot of your components all documented. You might be creating something on the fly. There might be that small, unique difference between them. But without that proper documentation, the designs in the mock-ups were often getting implemented in a much different way that they were intended. Things could be poorly documented. If you had a project with a lot of pages, you don't really expect the developer on your team or the designer who has to create the documentation to go through all the screens and pop up or an interaction and say, all of them are like this, because there might be one that wasn't. And so somebody makes a pop-up, they code the pop-up, and out of nowhere, you suddenly have 6, 7, 8 different versions of the same pop-up. So again, creating more work than what was needed. So seeing a lot of these, Brad Frost, who's a web designer and a consultant and also a musician in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, he was sort of inspired by chemistry and created atomic design, which was a methodology that allowed you to describe and organize components in your design system. And he really took it from the chemistry point of view. You start with an atom, you build a molecule, molecules become organisms, then you had templates and pages. So a 5-step process. A lot of folks had issue kind of understanding that transition of those mixed metaphors from science into actual developments. And then came component-based design out of that transition. So component-based design, at its essence, is simply splitting UI into much smaller, manageable parts with very distinct naming. And it's actually broken down into 6 very distinct groups. So at the start of group 1 is your identity. Most of the time, this is what we've commonly seen as styles. Your brand style guides, Not necessarily getting into the details of a web style guide at this point, but you're really starting with just your typefaces and your typographies, some of your gradients, and these become the base of the work. Sometimes for agencies, this is supplied by the clients, and then you move forward into component-based from there. Other times you need to create it from scratch. The second part is your elements. These are the smallest pieces, the most usable, reusable pieces that you can. Your buttons, your links, your inputs, your drop downs, and all the different states that they're in. Their clicked state, their hover state, their disabled state. You're actually creating the visuals of these very early on and applying the styles early on in the process. The base phrase that you'll hear most people say is you define an element once and you reuse it throughout the project over and over again. So the next stage up would be your components. For most developers, when you think of a component, you're thinking more of that module look that you see on a screen. But in component-based design, the components can be anything that uses multiple elements. Put two elements together, package them in a group, and you've basically created a component. So this could be your cards, commonly used a lot in design, your heroes, and also your navigation menu. In component-based design, you actually want to think through what are the different breakpoints that they're going to have? How is everything going to move early on? And you want to set those. And this is a great conversation to have with the developers really early on before they start designing just for the web page and then have to go back and do it for mobile and rearrange everything. So the next stage up is a composition. A component is a combination of multiple elements. As you can imagine, a composition is the combining of multiple components. This is where you're kind of defining everything from the small spacing in between to how it should interact as an entire piece on the page. The next step is your layout. It's where you start to put your grids into place, where you're going to plan your white space. By defining them like this, it's a lot easier for the designers to come into a project and use the extensive styles and guidelines where you've set them already for the tablet, for the mobile, as well as the desktop pages as well. The last stage is to create pages. You've got all the pieces, now you can put them together at what's called the page level. Using component-based allows you to design multiple pages, just reusing possibly only 10 to 15 different components put together in the different compositions, so that each page has its unique feel without having to redesign 10, 12, 15, 20 different page templates, which then anytime you wanted to change, now you have to go back and change an entire page. With component-based, it allows you to make very simple changes to one component and doing it across all of the pages, reducing a lot of the risk that you would have in possibly missing an update or a change that's needed. So how do we use this to talk to our clients? As we said at the beginning, it's relatively new. The majority of people are used to wireframes and then seeing a high fidelity mock-up PDF or possibly an online prototyping tool. And then they see it on a web page to be able to test interactions. So our approach needs to be slightly different in helping guide our clients through component-based design and what to expect in the process. Traditionally, our process here for design following our discovery period has been to use the sitemaps and the taxonomy. Then we add the brand identity. We do the desktop wireframes because that's what everybody's used to, test them. Okay, now we got to go back. We have to do the mobile. Now we got to apply the styles since everybody's agreed on them. Then we prototype, then we test, then we document everything out. Where we're very efficient at doing these through a lot of the tools that we use, there are ways to make slight different improvements. So the first thing that we do with component-based design, the approach that we need to take, and we need to help our clients understand, is that we're really going to stop designing pages. And this is a really frightening thing for designers because we're asking them to create components without really seeing where they're going to be placed and how we're going to be used. But here we spend a lot of time understanding who we're designing for and what those certain goals are that we want to have them do. So one of the first things to help not only internally but externally people understand is we're really going to not be designing pages. We're going to start looking at what features we need to focus on and how the user is going to go through them. We spend a lot of time in our discovery process understanding who we're designing for, what a client's KPIs are, what we're trying to get them to do. So we need to take all of that information that was earlier done and start putting it into action, asking ourselves, what actions do we want our users to do? Is it to just have them see a pretty page? Or we want them to sign up and log in. And then we have to think, what are the components that we need to do to accomplish that action? This can be really frightening for designers because you're asking them to design a function without seeing where it fits in the rest of the page. For our clients, it's also a different approach because their next concern is, where's it going to be? What's going to be above it? All those questions that need to be future answered. Component-based design focuses on the user and the actions that you want to achieve first, that real true user experience and user interaction. The other thing that you need to do with component-based design, we need to be a little bit more generic. We don't need to worry if a button is a login button versus a sign up button. A button is a button. A drop down is a drop down. How many times you click on a drop down and sometimes it drops down, sometimes it flies out to the side. You want to have that consistent interaction for the end user to know, when I click on this, it's going to do this. I have the same expected behavior over and over again. Your lists are all lists. It's simply a list. And this allows the developers to also have consistency in those designs and going forward. Component-based design also allows for a lot of flexibility. Instead of worrying about designing cards, does everybody have the same information? You can't post something until everybody has the information, but you don't need to design 3 separate different cards. Working with the developers, understanding the information, and getting that scalability, you can actually work in those problems early into the process. So for example, if a photo doesn't exist on the back end in the CMS, the client can simply leave the photo field blank, and the component still looks like it belongs in the set. The information is still there. Whenever a photo becomes available, the client can simply add it in through their CMS. The image appears using the exact same component, and there was no coding or no rearranging needed. So the same component, just with slight different alterations to it. A card that has the ability to just have the text, but sometimes it's going to be a date. Sometimes it's going to be an event date. Other times it might be an image for something you're going to sell. You're starting with the same component and building out. But this is also why the communication between the developers and designers is really important from the very beginning. On the front end, a component can look the same, but may actually be 2 separate components because it really depends on what is the data and the system driving it. So again, when you think about what our process typically is, with this collaboration, with using component-based design, where a lot of information is upfront, just seeing components and elements on a page, it can be a really hard thing because you're simply just looking at a sheet of buttons and boxes and squares, and you're wondering, where do they go? When you're looking at the deliverables that component-based design does, you've got the brand identity. Now you can simply output the different wireframes and prototypes, not only for the desktop, but the mobile at the exact same time. To keep it simplified, we can actually just move right to the wireframing as long as we've planned out everything in advance and manage those expectations with our clients and determined how much they want to be involved in the process. It's going to happen a lot faster. They'll be able to quickly see going from one wireframe to having multiple pages out a lot sooner than where they're waiting for, we need this page, okay, we've approved this one, now we need this page. We're able to move the process along a lot faster. So as you can see, component-based design gives us a lot more flexibility. Not only is it helpful for us internally to be much more collaborative and efficient in how we use our time, it makes us more strategic in how we develop for our clients, the things that we consider. And for our clients, it allows them to have one system in the back end that can power one site or 4 sites without feeling like they're disconnected. One change in their CMS can change across multiple sites if they need it to. There's a lot of power in component-based design, and it's just going to continue to grow with new technologies and the need for scalability across.